ways of building the authoritarian regime. Now, take a look at the level of reserves. This is really, I think, a very dramatic figure. One way that we measure the healthy supply of reserves, how much dollars you have, is to think in terms of how many reserves do you have to cover your imports. And Latin America has had a pretty fantastic run. It has taken care of a major problem that Latin America typically has with its reserves. And you can see the bars for Latin America and the Caribbean doing very nicely, and Venezuela's performance chronically in disaster. So this is even before Maduro. This is in 2012. To have 4 months worth of imports and levels of reserves is very bad news. This is the situation that in 1989 produced the Gran Viraje, the neoliberal, the Venezuelan signing the famous letter of intent with the IMF, committing it to a program of market-oriented reforms. So Venezuela is at this point now. The difference is that the price of oil is still very high, so dollars keep coming in. In other words, they have decided that if they can stop selling dollars or limit the amount of dollars that they make available, they can sort of like weather the storm. All right, so let me skip this part of the deficits because you get the picture. Oh, no, I won't skip this one. Let's compare Venezuela with OPEC nations, not just Latin America. And here what we have is deficit spending. And the nice thing about comparing it with OPEC nations is that they are nations also undergoing the oil windfall that Venezuela is having. And as you can see, most OPEC nations saved and had a really good performance in terms of having surpluses. Venezuela did not. A wonderful example of economic mismanagement and pro-cyclicality. If you know anything about economics, you'll know that even market-oriented folks will tell you that the worst way to manage an economy is pro-cyclically. In other words, to spend more money when you're in having growth years, which is what Venezuela did. All right, so this is the same thing. So you have the fiscal deficit. And this is what the situation was when Chavez died. Very high. And it begins to produce inflation. This is the highest inflation in the world today. If you were studying Latin America or the world economy in the 1980s, this number wouldn't have been impressive. But in the low inflation environment of today, this is at the level of Sudan and the level of Syria. Those are the countries that come close. It's really, and it's probably an undercount, as in other countries in Latin America. The official inflation figure understates the actual size of the inflation. Now, what the government does is it begins to implement an attack of inflation in a very populist way. And the populist way is through controls. Rather than letting the market do its job, but we're going to control the exchange rate, we're going to control prices, we're going to control labor markets, we're going to control everything that we can. And that approach, there's a figure of the inflation rate compared to Latin America, but you get the price controls, and the price controls, you don't have to be an econ major to know that price controls produce scarcity, any types of controls, and so you begin to have a serious shortage situation. And the reason is the government has high inflation. Producers are being told you can only sell a product at a certain level, but if the inflation is too high, you cannot sell that product at that price and make a profit, so you discontinue. And so you have the scarcity. It is the result of the private sector, but it's really the result of a macroeconomic distortion. So you get this strange combination of inflation and scarcity. By the way, it happened in Cuba, continues to this day, a lot of scarcity. In Cuba, you don't have inflation, you have long lines, which is the same thing, to get products. Oh, I did it again. And what the government does by the end of 2013 is we're going to blame the business side for the inflation and for the scarcity. And for radical Chavistas, this discourse worked because this is an argument that has a populist appeal. And so Maduro runs for the regional election on a campaign of, yes, we have high inflation, and yes, we have scarcity, but the guilty party here is the business sector. And the solution is, let's expropriate more, let's do more price controls, let's demonize. This actually helped him electorally. This argument made sense. And so he has a very good election. It's a regional election, and his interpretation of the election is, now I am safe. I am back to being a competitive authoritarian regime. I can compete, and what I'm going to do is to deepen the revolution, deepen the sectarianism, deepen this is going to be a system for those who are friends and family of the ruling party. This was the immediate reaction to the December 2013 elections, and so predictably, people got angry economically and politically. Economically, because there is nothing coming from this government that makes you think that inflation and scarcity are going to disappear, because if you know anything, you know that the real problem is not being addressed at the level of economic policy. And politically, because this is the strangulation of democracy that Chavismo was always about. You're an opposition actor, an elected opposition even, and you're being denied any space or even legitimacy. And so the protests began shortly after, and here's an example of one recent one. The protests, let me just say a few things about this. I don't know how we're doing, and then let me just show you this little. Let me go over here and talk a little bit about this. Yes, like the protests in Chile from 2011 to 2013, like the protests in Brazil this summer, these are middle-class protests by middle-class folks in middle-class neighborhoods. Remarkably, nobody disparaged the Brazilian protests and the Chilean protests for being middle-class, whereas the supporters of the government want to disparage this for being middle-class. But what can you expect other than middle-class protests? Take a look, and this is calculation of the different quintiles of Venezuela based on the possible income of the average member. This is, you break the economy in terms of the different income levels. You divide them into the poorest tenth and the richest tenth. And I'm using the definition from the World Bank of who falls into poverty and who falls into low middle class, or just middle class, upper middle class, and very rich. What you see is that we only have data for 2012. There's no question that the oil boom in Venezuela, however mismanaged it was, did change Venezuela from the time that Chavez came in. Here's when Chavez comes in. The majority was, by the way, being low middle class is very poor. I'm using the definition for the World Bank, but this is very precarious living. So that's why I put them here. This is when Chavez comes in. This is the first part of Chavez, the first set of protests. And then the oil boom comes in, and you see this reduction. So Venezuela is a very middle-income country. And, this is part of the oil boom. This is, by the way, this happens elsewhere in the developing world. We have seen the rise of the middle classes. The reduction of poverty has occurred everywhere. The debate in Venezuela is not whether it happened or not, is whether the return is commensurate with the investment. Given how much money went in, is this the best you could have done? How come the rich folks aren't here? And rich, I mean an income of about $50 per day. So to have middle-class protests in this country shouldn't be shocking. One could make the case that being middle class and not having links with this sector here was political trouble. But here it doesn't seem to be that insignificant. And besides, we see it in Brazil, in Chile, in Ukraine, in Egypt, in Thailand. There's something about the unrest in the middle classes. There's something about the middle classes that makes us think that if there's going to be a protest against governance, not against hunger, but a protest against governance, that it is going to be led by the middle classes. Nevertheless, one could still say it should be worrisome for the opposition that many poor and low middle income folks haven't joined in. That is true. They should worry about that, and they should never be too complacent. But take a look at this as my final chart. This has got to be the most dramatic poll I've read about Venezuela in the last year. This pollster asked Venezuelans if this is very recent. It happened in March. It's data from March, in the middle of the protests. The question is, would you go out into the streets to defend the government if President Maduro asks you to? Under the peak of Chavez could rely on voluntary Chavistas to go out into the streets. This was so intimidating that it deflated the protests of 2003-2004. He had el pueblo chavista, los cerros y los barrios salían a las calles. So let's ask the question. First, based on affiliation, you get that 48.5% of Chavistas say they would do it. You know, this is still good. Probably in 2002, Chavistas would have said yes in greater numbers. But then we have the answers per income levels. And here it's divided into 5 quintiles rather than 10 deciles. And these are the lowest ones. This is really amazing. Most poor folks are not willing to come out into the streets. So it is true that the protesters in Venezuela should worry a little bit about the poor folks not embracing them. But it is absolutely true that in the new... Yeah?
It doesn't fit, no? So it means that there are very few people affiliated. Otherwise, the two tables don't fit each other.
Right. They are different. They are not... one is just breaking down the data based on your political affiliation, and the other one on income. So they're separate.
But the low table means all the population?
The low table means...
all population in the country, but that in order to fit the top one must be that the political affiliated must be very few people.
Yes. Or also wealthier, not just from these groups, which I think is true. It's part of the cronyism that exists. Yes. I mean, we need to work more with this data to really draw any conclusions, but yes, how come there is this big difference? Where is this coming from? How big is this? This poll says that this size has shrunk significantly. It's at the level of 35%.